A millionaire on the brink of death asked a homeless girl to pretend to be his daughter for a day. When the girl's mother arrived, the man began to cry upon seeing who she was. The mansion stood tall in the darkness of the night, a shadow of its former splendor. Its windows covered in dust and darkened by the lack of light hid a world that seemed frozen in time. The once meticulously cared-for gardens were now overtaken by weeds, and the withered trees creaked under the wind as though they too mourned their owner's neglect. It was a place that no longer reflected life, but a grim stillness that permeated every corner inside. Trevor Kamara walked with difficulty through the mansion's marble halls. Each step and effort, his bones no longer seemed willing to take his hunched, fragile figure moved slowly beneath the faint light that illuminated the antique furniture and crystal chandeliers still hanging from the ceiling. The luxury of the house seemed to have lost its shine, leaving only a void that seeped through the cracks of time in his study. Trevor sat at a desk, cluttered with papers and forgotten items, among them a well-worn photo album. He opened it with trembling hands, and his tired, glassy eyes settled on the images that had accompanied him for so many years. One in particular caused him pain as he gazed at it. Jenna is his daughter, so young and full of life, smiling as she picked flowers in the garden. Charlotte, his granddaughter, barely a child, appeared in the background playing beside her. Trevor ran, his fingers over the photo as if with that gesture he could bring back those lost days. Those moments that no longer existed outside of his memory. Nostalgia overwhelmed him, wrapping him in deep pain. He remembered the childhood laughter that once filled the house, the games and adventures he shared with Jenna and Charlotte. But all of that vanished in an instant. Jenna left after a fight that turned into an abyss between them, taking Charlotte with her. The daughter he had raised with such harshness and expectations distanced herself from him. And with her departure, his granddaughter disappeared from his life as well. Then came the news of the accident that claimed them both, leaving Trevor alone, condemned to live with the regret of never having made amends with them as night fell. Clara, his loyal the housekeeper, entered the study with a look of concern. She had worked for the Kamara family for over 3 decades, and her affection for Trevor was palpable, though she had never expressed it openly. She watched him cautiously, seeing the toll the years and guilt had taken on him. With a mixture of respect and care, she placed a cup of hot tea on the desk, hoping it might offer him some comfort. "Mr. Trevor, you should rest," she said gently, hoping he wouldn't reject her advice as he often did. Trevor, without taking his eyes off the album, he replied in a weary voice weighed down by the sorrow that crushed him. "Rest," he murmured, his tone bitter. "Rest is for those who don't carry guilt." Clara watched him in silence, a trace of sadness she never openly showed in her heart. She feared that Trevor was beyond any comfort, but she couldn't stop trying. She dared to take another step, speaking about something that had been troubling her for some time. "Sir," she said cautiously, "you still have time not to change what happened, but to find some peace. It's not good to live with such a weight." When Trevor heard those words, he slowly lifted his gaze to her, although his face was still marked by the harshness of his past. Something in his eyes showed he understood what Clara meant. However, his pride and his stubbornness pushed him to reject any attempt at a solution. "Peace doesn't belong to me, Clara," he replied, closing the album with a firm gesture. "Leaves me in peace with my memories." Clara nodded with a slight bow of her head, but did not insist. Instead, she withdrew in silence, leaving Trevor with his sorrow and loneliness. As she left the study, she turned off the light in the hallway, leaving the mansion shrouded in darkness. While he remained there, lost in thought, enveloped in a silence that seemed to crush him, the mansion continued its course, oblivious to the outside world. But inside, Trevor remained a prisoner of his own past, a shadow of what he had once been. And as the darkness loomed over him, loneliness became his only companion, his only certainty. It was a dark and rainy night when Charlotte arrived at the mansion. The storm, relentless and fierce, the battered, lonely streets clashed with raindrops against the asphalt and windows, creating a noisy symphony that filled the air. The wind howled, and the small figure struggling to move through the downpour appeared as a shadow lost in the darkness. Her clothes were soaked, her broken backpack hung from her shoulder, and her face, marked by exhaustion, reflected the toughness of a life that had learned to withstand adversity. She was only 12, but her gaze already carried the weight of those who had to grow up too quickly. Charlotte had been wandering the streets all day seeking refuge in a world that had turned its back on her. She had knocked on doors, pounded on windows, but they all closed in front of her, ignoring her presence as if she were invisible. The mansion, which had once seemed a distant dream, was now her last hope, her final attempt to find something beyond the rain and darkness. The mansion loomed before her like a large fortress, imposing and distant, its windows closed tight. Let no hint of light escape. The place seemed to be asleep, but Charlotte had no other choice. She approached the front door, which still held some dignity. Despite the neglect that lingered outside, she knocked gently at first, almost a whisper, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, hoping that someone, anyone, was inside the mansion. Trevor, sitting at his desk, lifted his gaze upon hearing the knocks, puzzled by the sound amidst the storm. His body, now accustomed to stillness and isolation, tensed at the interruption. He heard the echo of the knocks reverberating through the empty halls. He hesitated for a moment, but something inside him urged him to stand up and walk toward the entrance. When he opened the door, he was met with a sight that sharply contrasted with the coldness of his home. Charlotte, soaked to the bone, was shivering from the cold. Her eyes, though filled with fear, also held a determination that Trevor couldn't help but notice. The girl looked at him with a mixture of pride and vulnerability, as if, on one hand, accepting her need for help, but on the other, trying to maintain some of her dignity. Trevor watched her for a few seconds, bewildered, and the initial distrust he had felt melted away in the face of something deeper, a human need, a trace of something familiar. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asked, his voice rough and tired but not cruel. There was something in his tone that did not immediately reject her, although his attitude remained distant. Charlotte didn't say anything right away. She was too tired, too exhausted to speak. She just looked up as if asking for permission to enter. The wind blew more rain onto her, and Trevor, feeling a strange mixture of compassion and confusion, invited her in. "Come in, you're going to get sick," he said, moving aside to let her pass. Charlotte, almost without thinking, accepted. She entered the mansion, and the warmth of the house enveloped her completely. The contrast between the cold storm outside and the warmth inside was so overwhelming that for a moment she stood still, letting the warmth surround her. Closing her eyes for a brief instant, Trevor gently closed the door behind her, a sigh escaping his lips. As he glanced at her from the corner of his eye, despite his hard exterior, something in him shifted as he saw the fragility of the girl. "Go to the kitchen. I'll bring you something warm," he said, his tone almost paternal, but as distant as the rest of the house. Charlotte nodded with a barely audible murmur. She sat at the kitchen table, a large wooden table worn by use. Trevor served her a steaming bowl of soup, but the girl didn't touch it. Right away, she stared at the bowl as if afraid someone might take it from her. Then finally, she began to eat quickly, as though time were her enemy, and she didn't want to waste a single second of this small moment of relief. Trevor watched her in silence, a strange unease growing inside him. The girl reminded him of someone, but he couldn't place who. Perhaps it was the way she ate, with that need to survive, or perhaps something in her eyes that gazed, despite being so young, carried the mark of struggle and survival. Somehow, something about her moved him as Charlotte continued eating. Trevor couldn't help but speak, though he wasn't sure why. His voice carried a mix of melancholy and curiosity. "My daughter Jenna, she always ate like this when she was little," he said without thinking. "She was always hungry for something more than food. She had dreams, and I didn't know how to help her." Charlotte glanced at him briefly but didn't answer. The silence between them was filled with unspoken words, stories. They both kept silent. It was clear she didn't want to open up to him, and Trevor didn't expect her to, but something in that stillness, in that unspoken exchange, began to wear down both of their defenses. Finally, Trevor broke the silence. Driven by a mixture of nostalgia and desperation, "I'm going to make you a proposal, girl," he said, suddenly looking at Charlotte with a seriousness that surprised even him. "I want you to stay here for a day as if you were my daughter. Do it for me. Pretend to be Jenna, even if it's just for a day." Charlotte looked at him confused, not fully understanding the proposal. Trevor, seeing her expression, hurried to clarify. "It's not a joke," he continued. "I just need to relive a little of the lost time. I'm not asking you to understand, just to accept." Charlotte looked at him in silence, her face unreadable, but after a few moments she nodded slowly. She didn't quite know why, but something inside her told her she didn't have much to lose, At least here she'd find food and shelter, and maybe, just maybe, she could understand something more about the man who had taken her in so suddenly. "All right," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll do it." Trevor looked at her for a moment longer, noticing a silent decision in her tacit agreement. For the first time in a long while he felt the house, though empty and filled with broken memories, beginning to come alive. Without saying another word, Trevor retired to the living room, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts as she continued eating. The rain outside seemed to lessen, as if the world for a moment had stopped, giving them a brief respite in the midst of the storm. The next morning came with a timid sun barely able to pierce the gray clouds. The mansion, bathed in the soft light, seemed less gloomy than usual, although still wrapped in an atmosphere of melancholy. Charlotte, having accepted Trevor's peculiar proposal, waited in the foyer. Her usual distrust was present, but curiosity began to creep into her thoughts. Trevor appeared with a studied calm, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, as if he wanted to honor the day he had planned. In some way his face, though marked by the wrinkles of age and the weight of years, showed a renewed energy. "We start with the greenhouse," he said, pointing to a hallway leading to the east side of the house. It was one of Jenna's favorite places. Charlotte followed him in silence as her eyes adjusted to the luxury and details of the mansion. Upon entering the greenhouse, she was surprised by what she saw: a large glass enclosed space filled with wilted and abandoned plants. Though now covered in dust and cobwebs, it was easy to imagine what it must have been like in its prime. A green oasis full of life. "We used to come here in the mornings," Trevor said, as he walked between the empty pots. "Jenna loved taking care of these plants," she used to say. "Each one had a story, and we could learn so much just by watching them grow." He stopped in front of a small pot where a withered flower was still fighting to survive, his gaze filled with sadness. "I never understood her passion for this. I was always busy with my business, thinking the important thing was giving her a comfortable life. But I never stopped to see the value in the simple things she loved." Charlotte listened silently, feeling that each of Trevor's words carried a weight that went beyond mere plans. She didn't know how to respond, so she stayed still, watching the greenhouse as if she could absorb something from the memories that seemed to float in the air. After a while, Trevor headed toward the water gardens. They walked along weed-covered paths, surrounded by trees that had grown out of control. Despite the neglect, the place retained an aura of grandeur, like an enchanted forest trapped in time. "We used to play here," Trevor said, pointing to an old fountain in the center of the garden. "Jenna would invent games, saying we were explorers, looking for treasures. She always found ways to turn this place into something magical." Charlotte didn't say anything, but a faint smile appeared on her face. The image of a little girl running through the garden, transforming the world around her, was something she could easily imagine. Yet she also felt a pang of sadness, for those memories weren't hers. They were fragments of a life that didn't belong to her, but in some way they began to resonate within her. Finally, Trevor took her to the library, a huge room with shelves full of books that seemed to have been forgotten for years. In the center, there was a large dark wooden desk, and on it rested an old book with a worn leather cover. "This was Jenna's favorite book," he said, handing it to Charlotte. "We used to read it together before bed. She always wanted to be the heroine of the story, the one who saved everyone and changed the world." Charlotte carefully took the book and opened it, finding pages filled with illustrations and tiny writing. Trevor asked her to read a passage. At first, her voice sounded mechanical, as if she were fulfilling a task, but as she continued, something in the story began to touch her. Her voice grew clearer, and for a moment, it seemed as though she forgot her weariness and caution. When she finished, Trevor watched her with a strange look, a mixture of melancholy and satisfaction. "You have something of hers," he said softly. "I don't know what it is," but something. Charlotte didn't respond, but her hand still gripped the book. For the first time, she felt less like a stranger in this place, and more like someone who in some way was part of the story Trevor was trying to revive. The afternoon arrived with a silent and calm. As they walked through the mansion, Charlotte began to notice that though everything seemed broken or abandoned, each corner had a story. Trevor showed her more than a house. He showed her a world he had lost, a world he was now trying to reclaim, even if only for a day. And although Charlotte didn't fully understand it yet, something in that gesture began to touch a part of her that had been closed off for a long time. Night descended upon the mansion with the same stillness that had marked the entire day. The warm light of the gas lamps dimly illuminated the hallways, casting shadows that slowly danced on the walls. Charlotte walked silently down the long corridor, leading to the west wing of the house, had something in the air that kept her on edge, an invisible tension she didn't know how to describe it. Although Trevor's visit had been a kind of reconnection with the house's past, she felt there was something else he wasn't telling her, something she couldn't see, but that surrounded her like an uncomfortable perfume. Trevor, for his part, had patiently guided her throughout the day. He'd revealed memories, shown her the garden, the library, the greenhouse, and in each place he had let small fragments of his life. And Jenna's fall, however, he had not touched on the topic of her disappearance. Jenna's presence in his stories was constant, but always through the distorted memories of a man who seemed incapable of facing the pain of her absence. That night, after a light dinner, Trevor proposed they enter one of the rooms in the west wing that Charlotte hadn't seen before, a room whose door had been closed the entire time she had been in the mansion. "It's a special place," Trevor said with a look that seemed more absent than usual. A place Jenna used to take care of. Charlotte nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling of distrust. At first, she thought it was just her cautious nature, but as Trevor guided her through the dark hallways, a chill ran down her spine. Something in his demeanor had changed, as if everything he had said before now had a hidden shadow behind it. Finally, they reached the door, a large, dark, wooden door adorned with intricate wrought iron details. Trevor looked at it, and without saying a word, opened it slowly. Charlotte entered first, a dim light illuminating the room. It was a room where the air felt heavy, as if time had stopped there. The walls were decorated with old paintings, but what caught Charlotte's attention the most was a large table in the center of the room, upon which rested a collection of objects that seemed to belong to a very distant past. Dusty books, a carved wooden box with strange details, and what seemed to be an aged photograph of Jenna. "This was her sanctuary," Trevor said. His voice cracked. Where she could be alone and find some peace. Charlotte stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room as Trevor stood in the doorway. Something about his behavior made her uneasy. Even more, he was nervous, his hands trembling and his eyes avoiding looking directly at the objects in the room. Suddenly, something caught her attention at the back of the room. Behind a heavy draped curtain, she saw what appeared to be another smaller door. It was ajar, and something about it seemed to draw her attention. She couldn't resist walking toward it, driven by a mix of curiosity and the feeling that there was something hidden behind that door. "What's that door?" Charlotte asked, her gaze fixed on the crack that revealed a dark hallway behind it. Trevor seemed to hesitate for a moment. A flash of doubt crossed his face, as if he were weighing whether to tell her what really lay behind that door. "Just a storage room," he finally replied with a tense smile. "There's nothing important there." But Charlotte wasn't convinced. The answer sounded like an excuse, and her instincts told her the room held more secrets than Trevor was willing to reveal. However, she decided not to press. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in on her, as if the walls were tightening, trapping her in the silence. She so feared Charlotte turned and walked back to the center of the room, where Jenna's the photograph still lay. On the table, she stepped closer, studying it closely. It was a black and white image of a young woman smiling with long, loose hair. There was nothing particularly striking about the photograph, but Charlotte realized that Jenna's eyes seemed so alive in the image, so full of energy that contrasted with the stillness of the place. Why? Charlotte began, but the question hung in the air. Trevor watched her from the doorway as though waiting for something. The silence grew even denser. "It's curious," Trevor finally said in a soft voice. "Jenna always said the house would never let her go, that it was full of secrets only she could understand." Charlotte looked at him for a moment, searching his face for any clue about what he really meant. She didn't understand why Trevor kept talking about Jenna in the past, tense when it was clear he still remembered her with such intensity. "Did she mean it?" she asked. Quietly, Trevor looked at her for a few seconds before answering yes. He finally said, "Jenna always said the house had its own soul, that its walls were filled with memories and secrets that were never fully revealed, but were always there, waiting to be discovered." Charlotte felt disturbed by those words. The idea that the house could have a life of its own seemed absurd, but she couldn't help the feeling of unease that gripped her. Everything in that place, from the dark rooms to the whispers in the air, seemed connected to something greater, something beyond Trevor's memories. "It's late," Trevor finally said, interrupting the moment. "I think you should rest. Tomorrow will be another day." Charlotte nodded, though something inside her told her she shouldn't fully trust what Trevor had said, nor what he hadn't revealed. There was something behind the ajar door, something in the shadows she couldn't see, but that she felt was very close, and no matter how much she tried to avoid it, Charlotte knew she would soon have to face those secrets. The mansion fell silent once again in the stillness of the night. Somewhere within its vast interior, Jenna's story still awaited to be revealed, and Charlotte, with her heart racing and her mind full of questions, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply unsettling about everything she had discovered that night. Something that perhaps was closer than she had imagined. The next day began with a faint light that barely illuminated the mansion after the tension of the previous night. Charlotte decided to take advantage of a moment of solitude to explore the place that had begun to intrigue her deeply. Until then, she had stayed in the areas Trevor had guided her through. But something in the vastness of the house called to her, as if the walls themselves held secrets only she could uncover. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, an area she had barely glimpsed during her short stay. Each step she took echoed in the silence, as if the echo reminded her she was alone. Upon reaching the hallway, she noticed a door ajar that she hadn't seen before. Her curiosity pushed her to cross the threshold. The room seemed forgotten, covered in a fine layer of dust that testified to its abandonment. It was a small space, but full of details. On one side there was a bed with a hand-embroidered quilt, the floral design barely distinguishable from the passage of time. In a corner, a worn wooden rocking horse lay tilted as if it had been forgotten mid-play. Charlotte approached cautiously, feeling as though she were entering a place that belonged to someone else. On the desk, she found a carefully placed box. When she opened it, she discovered a handful of letters, some unopened and others with ink barely visible from the years. The first lines of one of the letters intrigued her. "Dear Jenna, if only I could turn back time." It was clear that the letters had been written by Trevor, full of regret he had never openly shown. There were words describing his love, his guilt, and a deep sadness that seemed impossible to repair. As she read, Charlotte felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she understood the pain that filled each line, but, on the other hand, she couldn't help but feel puzzled by how personal the words were, as if she were invading something very intimate. There were also photographs in the box. One in particular caught her attention. Jenna, as a young woman, sitting in the garden of the mansion with a small child in her lap. Charlotte looked closely, noticing that something in the child's features seemed strangely familiar. It was a sensation she couldn't explain, but it stayed with her as she placed everything back in the box. As Charlotte stepped out of the room, her heart beating faster than usual, she wondered why Trevor had never mentioned this place. The feeling that the mansion was full of untold stories grew stronger with every corner she uncovered. There was something in this place that hadn't been fully revealed yet, something waiting for the right moment to come to light. As she returned to the main hallway, Charlotte felt her relationship with both the house and Trevor changing. She was no longer just a child seeking shelter. Now she was part of a larger stage, a story she didn't fully understand but knew somehow included her. The day dawned calm with a clear sky, allowing the first rays of sunlight to illuminate the mansion's neglected gardens. After the intense conversation of the previous night, Trevor decided to break from their usual routine and suggested Charlotte spend some time outdoors. Though she said nothing, she nodded slightly, intrigued by the invitation. The gardens, though overgrown and covered in weeds, still held a melancholic beauty. The pathways bordered by tall bushes led to corners filled with wilted flowers and trees that seemed to guard forgotten memories. In the center, an old fountain stood silently, its stagnant water reflecting the sunlight. Trevor walked slowly, using a cane to support himself. As he guided Charlotte through the space, his face displayed a mix of nostalgia and sadness, as if each part of the garden returned a memory he would rather not relive here. "Jenna and I used to play," he said, finally stopping near the fountain. This was her favorite spot. "We spent hours inventing games and searching for treasures. She had such a vibrant imagination. She always saw things where I only saw plants and stones." Charlotte, who had kept an emotional distance until then, approached the fountain and gazed at the water for a moment. She could picture a little girl running down those paths, laughing as she created stories from the elements around her. Though she didn't say it aloud, something in Trevor's description resonated with her, as if she could clearly see that past. "And why did you neglect it?" she asked finally, her tone more curious than accusatory. Trevor sighed, leaning on his cane, as he surveyed the garden. "When Jenna left this place, lost its life. Without her here, it didn't make sense to maintain it. Every plant she cared for seemed to remind me of her absence." so I let time take care of everything." Charlotte nodded, partly understanding that decision. She had learned in her short life that sometimes it was easier to let things wither than face the task of caring for them. Without a clear reason, they continued their walk, passing by a rose bush that must have once been impressive, but now was covered with thorns and dried flowers. Trevor stopped and gently touched one of the branches. "Jenna always said roses were like life, beautiful but full of thorns. I always thought it was just a child's nonsense, but now I think she was right." Charlotte, who had been silently watching, let out a faint smile. It was rare for her to show such a sincere emotion, but Trevor's words made her feel less alone in her own way of seeing the world. Finally, they reached a bench near a small pond, though the water was covered in leaves and seemed forgotten. There was something serene about the place. Trevor sat down with difficulty and pointed to a large, sturdy tree next to the bench. "We planted that tree together when Jenna was your age. She always said it would grow taller than the house, and one day she'd sit under its shade to read her favorite stories." Charlotte looked at the tree attentively, noticing its imposing presence. Somehow it seemed to be the only element of the garden that hadn't succumbed to neglect. Its branches stretched toward the sky, strong and alive, as though it refused to forget the purpose with which it had been planted. "Did it succeed?" Charlotte asked, not taking her eyes off the tree. Trevor smiled faintly, though his expression was tinged with sadness. "No, she never had the chance." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. They both sat under the tree's shade, gazing at the pond and the garden that surrounded them for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion. Charlotte felt a genuine connection with Trevor. Although their lives were completely different, there was something in their shared sorrow that bound them together. Trevor, not noticing the thoughtful expression on Charlotte's face, allowed himself to say something more. "Sometimes the most important thing isn't what we accomplish, but what we leave behind. This tree is a reminder of that even when we're not here, something of us can remain." Charlotte didn't respond, but those words stayed in her mind as they returned to the house in the evening. She felt that the garden, with its broken beauty and forgotten story, had begun to tell her a part of Trevor's life that he couldn't express with words. That afternoon, after their time in the garden, Charlotte and Trevor returned inside the mansion. While he rested in the main hall, Charlotte decided to explore on her own. There was something in Trevor's words and in the connection they had shared during the day that left her with a persistent unease. She felt there was more to discover, more to understand about that man's life and the story of his daughter. Her steps took her back to the library as her hands skimmed the spines of the books. Her gaze stopped at one of the lower shelves, where something seemed to stick out. It was an old photo album, similar to the one she had seen before in Trevor's study, but smaller and more worn. Charlotte carefully took it and sat on the floor, opening it slowly. The first pages were filled with images of Jenna at different stages of her life, her childhood, adolescence, and youth. As she turned the pages, she began to notice something that caught her attention. There were photos of Jenna holding a baby. The child appeared in several images, growing with each page Charlotte turned. In one of the more recent photos, the child was about 3 years old and sitting on Jenna's lap, smiling widely. While holding a stuffed animal, Charlotte felt the air grow heavier around her. That child, there was something in her features that seemed eerily familiar. Her eyes, her smile. Even the way she tilted her head in the photo reminded her of someone of herself. Before she could delve further into that, thought she heard footsteps behind her. Trevor was standing in the doorway of the library, watching her in silence. His eyes were fixed on the album Charlotte held in her hands. "What's this?" Charlotte asked. Looking up at him, Trevor walked slowly toward her, as if the words weighed on him. "It's Jenna with her daughter," he replied in a soft voice. "My granddaughter." Charlotte, the name, dropped like a stone in the girl's heart. Charlotte felt her mind filled with questions, with possibilities she didn't want to accept, but that were becoming impossible to ignore. She closed the album and set it aside before standing up. "What happened to her?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Trevor sighed deeply and sat in one of the chairs by the window. "After Jenna left, I didn't know anything about them for a long time. I tried looking for them, but they didn't want contact with me. Then I heard about the accident. They told me both of them had died." He paused, looking at his hands. "But now I'm not so sure." Charlotte looked at him, furrowing her brow, trying to process what she had just heard. "What do you mean you're not sure?" Trevor looked up at her with an expression of uncertainty he had never shown. "Before there are things that don't make sense," he continued. "I couldn't confirm anything. I never saw the bodies. All I had was a police report and a sense of emptiness. But you," he paused, as if carefully choosing his words, "there's something in you that feels familiar. Something that makes me think maybe not everything is lost." Charlotte felt her heart race. She wanted to reject what he was saying, dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man trapped in his past, but she couldn't ignore what she had seen in the album, nor the words Trevor had spoken so seriously. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally. Although her voice betrayed the certainty she was trying to project, Trevor didn't insist. Instead, he slowly rose from his seat and approached her. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder and looked at her with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Maybe I don't know completely either," he admitted, "but if there's a chance you are who I think you are, I'm not going to waste it." Charlotte didn't respond, as a battle raged between her instinct to protect herself and her desire to know more, to understand why her life seemed intertwined with that of this man and his family. As Trevor withdrew, leaving her alone in the library, she looked at the photo album again. Something in those images still called to her, as if they were trying to tell her a truth she couldn't yet comprehend that night as she lay in her room. Trevor's words and the images from the album filled her mind. She couldn't ignore what she had discovered, but she wasn't ready to face it fully. She knew the answers were there somewhere in the mansion, waiting to be found. And though fear held her back, she also knew that she had no choice but to move forward. The mansion was steeped in an unsettling silence that night. Charlotte couldn't sleep. The revelations of the day had left her mind full of questions and her heart heavy with uncertainty. As she turned in bed, she heard a sound that didn't match the calm of the house. A loud knock on the front door. Charlotte quickly got up, feeling a strange knot in her stomach. The knocks repeated, this time more insistent. From the hallway, she watched Clara, with a suspicious air, turns on the lights and makes her way toward the entrance. Trevor appeared shortly after, leaning on his cane, visibly intrigued by the interruption. Clara opened the door. Cautiously letting a gust of cold air in, on the threshold stood a woman soaked from the light rain that had started to fall. Her dark hair hung in messy strands around her face, and her expression was a mixture of resolve and nervousness. "Who are you?" Clara asked. Firmly standing her ground at the entrance, the woman lifted her gaze, and as she did, her eyes met Trevor's. A moment of tension filled the space, as if time had stopped. He let his can fall to the floor and took a step forward, his face transforming into a mixture of astonishment and emotion. "Jenna," murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't call me that," the woman replied, her tone filled with reproach. "My name is Casey." Now the silence grew heavier. Clara looked at Trevor in disbelief, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Charlotte, watching from the shadows of the hallway, felt the ground beneath her feet shake. The woman before them was not only from Trevor's past, but she seemed to carry answers to the questions that had tormented her. "How and why," Trevor began to say, but the words caught in his throat. Casey crossed the threshold. Glancing around with a mixture of disdain and nostalgia, she made her way directly to the living room, as if she knew the path perfectly, and stopped in front of the cold fireplace. Trevor followed her, his frail body trembling as he tried to process what was happening. "I came because I heard you were ill," Casey said without looking at him. "I couldn't leave this world without confronting you, without saying everything I never had the courage to say." Trevor looked at her, unable to speak. Charlotte, who had followed Clara into the living room, stood near the entrance, trying to remain invisible while listening to the conversation. "Why didn't you ever look for me?" Trevor finally asked, his voice broken. "I thought you were dead, but that both of you were dead." Casey let out a bitter laugh and turned to face him. "Dead," she said, her eyes filled with contained tears. "I left because I couldn't stand living under your control. I changed my name, my life, everything, to start over. And when I left, I knew you'd never come looking for me, because you never understood what you made me do." Trevor took a step toward her, his eyes full of a mixture of desperation and regret. "I didn't know," he began to say, but Casey interrupted him. "You didn't want to know. Your pride was bigger than any love. You could have felt for me, or for Charlotte." The name resonated in the air, and Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. Casey noticed the girl's reaction and looked at her for the first time. Her expression changed, shifting from anger to astonishment. "Who is she?" Casey asked, her tone fixing disbelief and hope. Trevor, who could barely stay on his feet, looked at Charlotte, then at Casey. "She's Charlotte," he said slowly, his voice trembling. Casey moved toward the girl, her eyes fixed on her. Charlotte shrank, slightly under her gaze but didn't back away. Something about the presence of this woman both drew her in and unsettled her at the same time. "Is it possible?" Casey asked, barely able to speak, her hands trembling as she moved a little. Closer, Charlotte, unsure of what to do, could only look at Trevor, seeking answers, but he too seemed as lost as she was. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Clara, who had been watching everything from a distance, finally intervened. "I think we all need answers," she said firmly, breaking the silence. "But tonight is not the time to resolve everything, Casey. You should stay. It seems there are many things that need to be clarified." Casey nodded slowly, but didn't take her eyes off Charlotte. There was something in her gaze that the girl couldn't understand, a mixture of pain, hope, and guilt that seemed too big to be expressed in words. As the night went on, the mansion seemed more alive than ever, full of contained emotions and truths on the verge of coming to life. Charlotte, caught in the center of this reunion, knew her life was about to change in a way she had never imagined. The morning arrived with a dense atmosphere in the mansion. The air felt heavy, and the silence that once defined the house was now broken by murmurs and nervous movements. Casey, now seated in the main living room, looked around the place with a mixture of familiarity and rejection. Clara kept a prudent distance, watching without intervening, while Trevor remained standing next to the cold fireplace. His gaze was fixed on the floor. Unable to hold Casey's eyes, Charlotte watched from the entrance. Still and alert, she felt that something important was about to happen. Although she didn't know exactly what the tension in the room was, it was palpable and emotional. Battlefield ready to explode. "Why did you bring me here?" Trevor, Casey finally asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was cold, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying the strength she was trying to project. Trevor slowly lifted his head and met his daughter's gaze. His face reflected a mixture of pain and regret. "I didn't bring you here," he replied in a low voice. "You came on your own, and although I didn't expect to see you, I'm grateful that you did. I need to explain so many things to you." Casey left out a bitter laugh and crossed her arms. "Explaining," she said sarcastically. "Explain what, Trevor? Why did you control every aspect of my life? Why did you make me feel like I was never enough? Why did you make me leave so I could breathe?" Trevor remained silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words, but none seemed sufficient. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he began, his voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting you, giving you the tools to succeed, but now I know I just pushed you away from me." Casey stood up from her with her eyes shining with contained tears. She walked slowly toward him, but her steps were not those of someone seeking comfort. They were the steps of someone ready to confront years of pain. "No, Trevor," she said, raising her voice. "You didn't protect me. You suffocated me. You made me feel like my dreams didn't matter, like the only thing that mattered was what you wanted. That's why I left. That's why I changed my name. That's why I left." Everything that reminded me of you behind Trevor didn't respond immediately. His fragile, hunched body seemed even smaller under the weight of his own mistakes. "I can't change what I did," he said finally in a broken voice, "but I'm here now, willing to do whatever it takes for you to find some peace so we can find it together." Casey looked at him for a long moment, evaluating his words. Her hands trembled, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Before she spoke again, she repeated almost in a whisper, "After all this time, do you think it's as simple as saying I'm sorry? You think you can repair years of pain with a few words?" Casey took a step back, as if distance could protect her from the avalanche of emotions she was feeling in that moment. Her eyes turned to Charlotte, who was still watching from the entrance, and her Casey asked, pointing to the girl, "What role does she play in all this?" Trevor looked at Charlotte, then back at Casey. His voice softened but didn't lose its gravity. "I'm not sure, but I feel like she has a connection with us, a connection I can't ignore." Casey furrowed her brow, clearly confused. She walked toward Charlotte, who remained still, facing the intense gaze of the woman. "Who are you?" "Really?" Casey asked, her tone softer but filled with curiosity and caution. Charlotte didn't know what to say. She looked to Trevor for help, but he too seemed lost in his own thoughts. Finally, in a low but firm voice, she said, "I'm Charlotte. That's all I know." Casey stared at her for a moment longer, as if trying to decipher a riddle. Then she stepped away and sat down again, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "This is too much," she murmured, covering her face with her hands. "Much for one day." Clara, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "Maybe we should take a moment to breathe," she suggested in her practical tone. "There are a lot of emotions at play, and it's clear this conversation won't be resolved in one night." Trevor and Casey nodded weakly, but neither moved. The room remained silent as each person dealt with their own emotions and thoughts. Charlotte, for her part, felt as though she had entered the heart of a storm, one where answers seemed as elusive as they were necessary as the night went on. The mansion filled with a quiet tension. Although words had begun to flow, the wounds were still open, and the truths that needed to come to light were still shrouded in shadow. Hours later, Casey returned to the main hall, but this time she was carrying something in her hands, a worn wooden box. Her steps were determined, but her face showed a mixture of fear and hope. She placed the box on the table and opened it carefully. Inside there was a worn stuffed animal, a blanket embroidered with the name Charlotte and several photographs. Charlotte, who had been watching from a corner, took a step forward, drawn to the objects. Her heart raced as she saw the stuffed animal. Without thinking, she extended her hand and picked it up. Something about it stirred a feeling she couldn't explain, as if she were touching a lost fragment of her own life. "This," she whispered, staring at the stuffed animal with wide eyes. "I know this." Casey took a deep breath, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Charlotte. "It was she said with a trembling voice. "It was my daughter's favorite toy, Charlotte." Charlotte looked up, feeling the ground beneath her feet. "Shake your daughter?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Casey nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I lost you when you were a baby. It was an accident. I lost custody. They searched for you. They took you, and I could never find you. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped wondering if you were alive, if you were okay." Charlotte's world swayed. Casey's words were like a whirlwind, trapping her, filling her mind with questions, doubts, and a feeling of vertigo. She looked at Trevor, searching for something, anything, that could give her stability. But he too seemed caught in the same emotional storm. "Is it true?" Charlotte asked her, voice laden with desperation. "Am I that?" Trevor slowly approached, tears in his eyes, but no definitive. "Everything fits," he said in a faint T voice. "I can't say it with certainty, but I feel that it's you, that you're my granddaughter." Charlotte took a step back, shaking her head at everything she was hearing was too much to process. She felt her breath quicken, and her chest seemed to tighten. "No," she finally exclaimed. "This doesn't make sense. I can't be her. I'm not her." Casey stepped toward her, but Charlotte raised a hand, stopping her. "Can't do this," Charlotte said with tears in her eyes. Then she ran out of the room, leaving Casey and Trevor in silence, both with broken hearts. Charlotte locked herself in one of the mansion's rooms, leaning against the door. As her body trembled, Casey's words echoed in her mind, hitting her again and again. For the first time, she felt that her life, this life she had always known as solitary and disconnected, could be part of something bigger. But she also felt the weight of a pain she didn't know how to handle. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Casey collapsed into a chair, her tears falling freely. Trevor sat beside her, placing a trembling hand over hers, and looked at her with eyes full of sadness. "It's her," he said quietly. "I know it." Casey nodded weakly, but her gaze remained fixed on the door Charlotte had exited through. She knew there was much to heal, but she also knew she couldn't give up. Not this time. The next day dawned with a silence that enveloped the mansion like a heavy blanket. The atmosphere was tense, and Charlotte, who had barely slept, remained locked in her room. The events of the previous night still pulsed in her mind, every word Casey had said resonating like an echo she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Casey and Trevor sat facing each other. Clara, ever discreet, remained nearby but silent. They both knew they had to speak, that words held the only hope of rebuilding what had been broken. However, the weight of the years and the mistakes they had made kept them in a tense equilibrium. "Trevor," Casey began, her voice laden with exhaustion, "there's something I can't stop thinking about. Why did you let things get this far? Why didn't you really try to find me?" Trevor sighed deeply, letting his shoulders sink under the weight of his guilt. "I tried, Casey, at least in the beginning, but I didn't know where you were. I didn't know how to find you when the news of the accident came. I thought there was nothing else to look for. I gave up, and now I know it was the worst mistake of my life." Casey nodded, though her eyes were still filled with resentment. There was something in those words that didn't quite convince her. "It wasn't just the accident, Trevor," she said bitterly. "It was your pride. You always wanted to be in control even when it meant losing everything." Trevor didn't argue. Instead, he lowered his gaze, silently accepting the reproach. Meanwhile, Charlotte, who had quietly left her room and approached the hall, fragments of the conversation reached her ears, pulling her in like a magnet. She stopped behind a half-open door, listening to every word with her heart in her throat. And Charlotte Casey asked in a softer tone, "How did you come to find her?" Trevor paused before answering, as if carefully choosing his words. "I didn't find her. She came here by chance, but when I saw her, something in me knew there was a connection, something I couldn't ignore." Casey let out a trembling sigh and covered her face with her hands when she spoke again. Her voice was broken. "I can't believe she's here. I can't believe that after all this time, after all the times I thought I would never see her again, that it could be her from her hiding spot." Charlotte felt tears welling up in her eyes. There was something heartbreaking in Casey's words and the mix of hope and despair they conveyed, yet fury also burned inside her. Why, after all these years, when she had already learned to live alone, did these people want to claim her? Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, she pushed open the door and entered the hall. Casey and Trevor turned toward her, surprised by her sudden appearance. "Enough!" Charlotte exclaimed, her voice trembling but filled with emotion. "Why are you telling me all this now? Why do I have to listen to stories about a life I don't remember?" "It's not fair." Casey slowly got up, her face marked by pain. "Charlotte, I'm not trying to force you into anything," she said, her voice broken. "I just want you to know the truth, to understand that I never stopped looking for you. That I always loved you, loved me," Charlotte repeated bitterly. "And where were you when I slept on the street? Where were you when they told me I was worthless? You weren't there. No one was." Casey took a step toward her, her hands trembling. "You're right," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I failed. I lost the chance to protect you, but now that I found you, I don't want to lose you again." Charlotte stood in silence, her breath heavy, emotions piled up in her chest, a mixture of rage, sadness, and something else she couldn't identify. Trevor, who had been silently watching it all, finally stood up and walked toward Charlotte. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Charlotte," he said softly, "we can't change the past. We can't erase what you've suffered. But if there's a chance to build something now, to be a family, please don't close that door on us." Charlotte looked at him, and for the first time she saw something unexpected in his eyes: vulnerability. The same vulnerability she had felt in herself for so long. Without saying a word, she turned and ran out of the hall, leaving Trevor and Casey in silence with broken hearts. She knew she couldn't face everything in that moment, that she needed time to understand what was happening. Casey collapsed to her knees crying while Trevor embraced her, his own tears falling in silence. They both knew they had opened a door that could never be closed, but they also knew that the road to reconciliation would be long and painful. Casey spent the rest of the day in a state of contained nervousness. Every time she tried to approach Charlotte, the girl pulled away, maintaining a physical and emotional distance. That seemed impossible to bridge. The tension in the mansion was palpable, and air thick with unease that could be felt in every room and hallway. Clara watched it all from a distance, concerned, but knowing there was nothing she could do to ease the situation. Charlotte, for her part, had found a temporary refuge in the library, there among the books, and in the silence. She tried to process what was happening. Despite her need to keep her distance, she couldn't stop thinking about Casey's words, the pain on her face, and the possibilities that all of this brought with it. But she also felt a weight in her chest, a mix of anger and sadness that she didn't know how to handle. Finally, as evening fell, Casey entered the library. Her presence immediately filled the space, though her steps were cautious. "Charlotte, can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Charlotte, sitting on the floor with a book in her lap, didn't look up. "I have nothing to say," she replied with a tone that tried to sound indifferent, although the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Casey took another step toward her, leaving the door open behind her. "I know this is hard for you," she continued. "Believe me, it's hard for me, too, but I can't stay here without trying to make you understand how much you mean to me." Charlotte slammed the book shut and stood up, facing her with eyes full of a mixture of anger and pain. "Now," she said, her voice rising, "now, you want me to believe I mean something to you. Where were you when I needed you? Why didn't you come sooner?" Casey swallowed hard, struggling to maintain composure. "I didn't know where you were, Charlotte. They searched everywhere, but the system lost track of you. I didn't give up, but everything was against me." "That's not enough," Charlotte shouted, stepping toward her. "I spent years alone, years believing nobody cared about me, and now you come here saying you searched for me, that you loved me." "It's too late." The words hit Casey like a blow. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. "You're right," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It's late, and nothing I say or do can change what you lived through, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to leave you alone again." Charlotte shook her head, stepping away from her. "I can't trust you. I can't trust anyone. People always say nice things, but in the end, they always leave." Casey stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I won't leave," she said firmly. "No matter how much you reject me, I won't leave. I'm your mother, Charlotte. And even if you hate me now, I'll never stop trying to show you that I'm here for you." Charlotte remained silent, her eyes filled with unshed tears. There was something in Casey's voice, something in her insistence that touched her more than she wanted to admit. But the fear was still there, deep and rooted. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. Finally, before walking out of the library, Casey was left alone with a broken heart, but determined. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that Charlotte had spent years building walls to protect herself, but she wasn't going to give up. As Charlotte climbed the stairs to her room, she passed by Trevor, who watched her in silence. He didn't say anything, but in his gaze was a mixture of understanding and sadness. He knew this was a path that Charlotte and Casey had to walk together, even if it was filled with stumbles and wounds. That night the mansion fell into silence again, but inside, emotions still pulsed strong and deep, waiting for the moment when they could transform form into something more than just pain. The mansion was completely silent. That night the rooms, usually filled with a cold stillness, now seemed heavy with the accumulation of emotions that had saturated the day Charlotte was in the library, sitting in a corner hugging her knees. The light from a nearby lamp cast soft shadows, but it couldn't ease the storm inside her. On the floor lay the items Casey had shown her that afternoon: the stuffed animal, the blanket with her name embroidered, and the photographs. Despite her resistance, she couldn't ignore what they meant. Meanwhile, Casey was in her room, sitting on the bed, her eyes fixed on a window that overlooked the garden. In her lap she held a photograph of her baby daughter, the same one she had kept as a treasure for years. Tears fell silently down her face as she struggled with the memories and guilt that had accompanied her for so long. In Trevor's study, Clara watched him with concern. He was sitting in his armchair, his gaze lost in the cold, darkened fireplace between his hands. He held a letter he had written years ago, addressed to Jenna, but never sent. Clara, who had always been direct with him, decided to speak. "Mr. Trevor, you can't keep going like this," she said softly, walking toward him with measured steps. "Charlotte and Casey need more than words and memories. They need to know they have something to hold on to." Trevor looked up at her, his tired eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and resignation. "And what can I offer them?" he asked. Quietly, "The only thing I've done is fail them. I failed as a father, and I failed as a grandfather. Now all that's left are a handful of regrets." Clara, firm but understanding, shook her head. "It's not too late to do something, but it has to be now. Words won't change the past, but they can give them a reason to move forward. If you really want to help them, show them that they can still count on you." Trevor nodded slowly, as if Clara's words had touched a nerve he had been trying to ignore in silence. He took a blank sheet of paper and began to write, while Clara stepped away to give him space for his thoughts in the library. Charlotte finally let the tears she had been holding back. Tears. She looked at the stuffed animal in her hands and hugged it to her chest, as if somehow it could fill the emptiness she felt. Her mind was full of questions. Could she trust Casey? Was it true that she had been searched for loved ones even after all the abandonment she had felt? It was easier to keep the wall she had built. But something in Casey's tone and in Trevor's insistence made that wall start to crumble. Meanwhile, Casey, unable to stay in her room, she walked toward the library. She stopped at the door when she saw Charlotte crying. Silently, though every part of her wanted to enter and comfort her, she decided to stay at the entrance, giving her space. Still, her presence didn't go unnoticed. "What do you want now?" Charlotte asked without looking at her, her voice trying to sound strong but clearly broken. Casey slowly approached, keeping her hands visible, as if afraid to scare off a wounded animal. "Nothing. she replied softly. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Charlotte let out a bitter laugh, looking at the stuffed animal in her hands. "Okay, I don't know what that means." Casey knelt in front of her, leaving some distance to avoid invading her space. "I didn't know for a long time either," she admitted. "But I'm here, and even though I know you don't trust me, now I'm not going to give up on you. I didn't before, and I won't now." Charlotte stared at her for a long moment. There was something in her words, in her tone, that seemed sincere, but the fear was still there, like an insurmountable barrier. "I don't know if I can believe you," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Casey nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I understand, and that's okay. But no matter how long it takes, I'll wait." They remained silent, the weight of the conversation filling the space between them. Charlotte didn't know if she could accept what Casey was offering, but a small part of her, buried under layers of pain, wanted to try. In his study, Trevor finished writing. He placed the letters in separate envelopes, one for Casey and one for Charlotte. In them, he put everything he had kept in his heart for years, his mistakes, his regrets, and the hope that both could find a path together, even if he wouldn't be there to see it. As he placed them on his desk, a slight smile crossed his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was taking a step towards something that could heal. Even if just a little, the wounds he had helped create that night. The mansion remained silent, but not in solitude. Each of its inhabitants, in their own internal battles, began to glimpse the possibility of a new beginning, even though the path toward it was still full of uncertainty. The morning sun brought fresh air to the mansion's gardens, which seemed more alive under the soft light. Charlotte had gone out early, looking for an escape from the tense atmosphere inside the house. She walked along the overgrown paths, observing the withered flowers and the twisted trees that time had shaped. Her thoughts remained heavy, as if every step brought her closer to a decision she wasn't ready to make. As she stopped near the central fountain, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Casey, who was approaching with a box in her hands. The woman had changed her clothes, and although her face still reflected the exhaustion from accumulated emotions, there was a new determination in her gaze. "I thought we could talk here," Casey said, her voice soft but firm as she lifted the box slightly. "I want to show you something." Charlotte frowned distrustfully, but didn't move as Casey sat on the edge of the fountain and opened the box. Inside there were a collection of carefully kept items: photographs, a small baby dress, a pair of worn-out shoes, and a handmade album. "What is all this?" Charlotte asked. Although her gaze was already fixed on the objects, "They are memories," Casey replied, taking the album and handing it to her. "Of your childhood, the few things I managed to keep before I lost you." Charlotte took the album with trembling hands. She opened it slowly and began flipping through the pages. Inside there were photos of a smiling baby, a young mother holding her with tenderness, and everyday moments filled with warmth. Each image seemed to tell a story. Charlotte didn't remember, but that felt eerily familiar. "Is this me?" she asked, in a quiet voice without looking up. Casey nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, that's you, my Charlotte." Charlotte kept flipping through the album until she stopped at a photo of a birthday. The little girl was wearing a white dress with a blue bow and was surrounded by balloons and a cake. Her fingers traced the image carefully, as if she could absorb some of the life captured in the photograph. "Why did you keep everything?" she asked finally, her tone more vulnerable than she intended. Casey took a deep breath before answering. "Because I never stopped believing that one day I would find you, even though everything seemed lost. These things were my way of holding on to you, of reminding myself that you were still part of me." Charlotte closed the album and looked at Casey for a moment. There was something in her mother's words that began to break through the layers of distrust she had built. "I can't forget what I went through," she said finally, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't just pretend everything is fine now." Casey leaned toward her, voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I'm not asking you to forget. I just want you to give me a chance to show you that I'm here and that I'll always be here." Charlotte didn't respond. Immediately she looked at the album in her hands, and then at Casey. Finally, with a slow gesture, she closed the box and handed it back. "I'm not promising anything," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'll think about it." Casey gave a weak smile, tears falling down her face. "That's more than I could ask for," she replied. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the birds sing and the breeze rustling through the trees. Although the distance between them still existed, something had started to change. There was a crack in the wall that separated them, a small opening through which a ray of hope was beginning to shine as they walked back to the mansion together. Casey dared to touch Charlotte's shoulder, a small gesture, but one full of meaning. Charlotte didn't pull away. She didn't say anything, but she allowed the contact. It was a first. Step small, but enough for both of them. It had been some time since that last conversation between Charlotte and Casey marked the first step toward reconciliation. Days passed one after another, like leaves being blown by the wind. Little by little, the tension between mother and daughter began to fade, replaced by a lighter, newer atmosphere. Though still filled with unresolved silences, Charlotte had started listening to the stories. Casey told her stories about her childhood, the painful decisions her mother had made, and the reasons for her absences. Casey, in turn, learned to respect her daughter's boundaries, to understand her fears and doubts without pushing her more than she could bear. And although the scars didn't disappear immediately, there was an undeniable truth in the air. They were both beginning to heal, like a devastated landscape that slowly regained its color, though with new shadows that would never fade. One sunny morning, Casey, with a determination she had never shown before, approached Charlotte. The young woman was sitting by the window looking out at the garden. At first she didn't see her, but when Casey came closer, Charlotte lifted her gaze, sensing the tension in her mother's face. "Charlotte," Casey said, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot, and I think the time has come." Charlotte looked at her in confusion, her mind still struggling to understand. Casey took a deep breath, and with a gentleness that reflected the depth of her feelings, she continued, "I've made a decision. I want you to come with me. I want us to leave all of this behind us. I need us to start over somewhere else where we can rebuild what we lost." Casey's words seemed to float in the air like an unattainable dream. Charlotte couldn't believe it. Could it really be possible? Were they really on the verge of a new beginning? For a moment, time seemed to stop. The idea of leaving everything she knew, embarking on a new life with her mother, filled her chest with a mixture of hope and terror. "Would you really do that?" Charlotte asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes filled with doubt and emotion. Casey looked at her tenderly, almost as if she had expected this question. She knelt beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "I wouldn't just do it, Charlotte. I will. Promise." Charlotte couldn't hold back the tears that began to fall. Finally, after so many years of pain, something new was beginning to be born. She threw herself into her mother's arms, and the two embraced as if the weight of everything they had lived through disappeared in that moment, in that long hug full of promises. But as the sun continued to shine in the garden, another sun was fading inside the mansion. Trevor, upon hearing Casey's decision, he felt as if the ground was shaking beneath his feet. Charlotte's face had been the light of his life, and Casey's presence, though turbulent, was an irreplaceable part of his existence. Now they were both leaving. They were leaving him. The worst part was that he couldn't stop it in his mind. The image of Charlotte leaving the house, climbing into a car with Casey, and disappearing from his life, repeated over and over. He couldn't bear it. The rage and helplessness overwhelmed him. Every corner of the mansion seemed to scream in his mind, "Why? Why?" Again, the day Casey told him, Trevor remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground while his mind exploded with contradictory thoughts. He knew Charlotte needed her mother, that the best thing for her was to find the peace she had lost. But that understanding didn't ease the emptiness in his chest. "And me?" he asked in a broken voice, unable to keep his composure. "And what happens to me?" Casey looked at him with sad eyes, as if the decision had been made long ago. But something in her eyes showed a hint of pain. "I'm not leaving you behind, Trevor. It's just that Charlotte needs a new beginning, and I do too. There are things that can't be fixed. Here, I'm sorry." Trevor remained silent, watching as his world crumbled. A deep feeling of despair filled him, like a giant wave dragging him away mercilessly. How could he live without them? How could he let them go? And alas, in a desperate attempt to keep them, he tried to speak, but the words got caught in his throat at the sight of Charlotte and Casey getting ready to leave, packing their things, and walking toward the exit together was too much. The blow of reality was stronger than he could bear. Suddenly, the pain in his chest overwhelmed him. It wasn't just sadness. It was a sharp pain so intense that it made him fall to his knees. A cold sweat ran down his forehead, and his breathing became labored. His hands trembled, and a deep dizziness took over him, as if life itself was slipping through his fingers. He collapsed. The sound of his fall echoed through the mansion's hallways, and Charlotte, upon hearing the noise, ran toward him, her heart pounding. She found her father lying on the floor, pale, Struggling to breathe normally, Casey arrived quickly, and together they lifted him, trying to help him regain his breath. Dad, Charlotte screamed desperately, her voice breaking with fear. Trevor could barely respond to his chest rose and fell with difficulty, and his face was contorted in pain. Casey knelt beside him, her eyes full of anguish as she tried to calm him. "You need to calm down, Trevor," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're going to be fine." But the pain didn't ease, and Trevor felt his life slipping away slowly. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't. In that moment, Charlotte took his hand, her tears falling uncontrollably. "Dad, please don't leave us. You can't leave us." Her words were a plea, a desperate cry that cut through any emotional barrier, and in Trevor's last breath, something inside him completely broke, but at the same time, a strange feeling of peace enveloped him. Perhaps it was the acceptance of the inevitable, perhaps just his. The sacrifice had been the last act of love for his daughter. The darkness was thick, heavy like a mantle that slid over him, wrapping him in a void he couldn't escape. Trevor didn't know how much time had passed, nor what had happened for him to find himself in this state. There was no pain but no peace either, just an unsettling stillness, as if everything around him was suspended in a limbo where time didn't make sense. Suddenly a flash of light pierced through his closed eyelids, followed by a soft sound like the murmur of several voices. At first his thoughts were scattered like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't fit together. He tried to move an arm, but a sharp pain ran through his body, and he quickly realized that he was tied to something, as if he was strapped to a bed. But no, he wasn't tied. He was restricted by something else, something he couldn't identify. "Where I am," he whispered, his voice rough. As if he hadn't spoken in weeks, a blink, his mind raced, but the confusion remained an impenetrable wall. Little by little, the light, which had been so intense, softened as if someone had adjusted the intensity of a lamp. A metallic cold brushed against his skin, and the sensation of being surrounded by machines, cables, and tubes only unsettled him more. A deep voice, one that Trevor recognized, only vaguely resonated in his ear, calming the storm in his head. "A little Mr. Trevor, you're okay. The surgery was a success. We've managed to stabilize you." The voice was a distant echo, but it brought some relief with an extraordinary effort. He tried to open his eyes with a clumsy blink at first, followed by a stronger second attempt. That's when his vision slowly began to clear. The first face he saw was that of a man in a white coat, a doctor, who was looking at him with a serious expression, but not without a certain gentleness. "How do I feel?" Trevor asked, and Apar's voice was hoarse and his throat dry. The doctor, seeing that he was starting to regain consciousness, nodded. "We've kept you sedated, but you're waking up. You've had a serious car accident, sir. You lost a lot of blood, but your heart held up. The surgery was complicated, but you made it." Though Trevor tried to process the words, but something didn't add up. Accident? But how did he end up here? What had happened? Accident? He said, a lump in his throat, unable to remember the details. Only a feeling of anguish kept swirling in his mind, as if something or someone was about to slip through his hands. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted his thoughts. The door opened abruptly, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Jenna, his daughter, her face drenched in tears. But with a relieved smile she couldn't hide, Trevor stared at her, unable to suppress the urge to rise and hug her, but his body didn't respond. "Dad," Jenna's voice trembled, and her eyes flooded with even more tears. When she saw him conscious, she ran to his side, gripping his hand tightly, as if afraid he would disappear again. "Jenna," Trevor whispered, confused by his searching for answers in his daughter's eyes. He didn't fully understand what was happening. He only knew that his daughter was there, that he was still alive, and that something deep inside connected him to her, something far beyond the confusion overwhelming him. Jenna let out a sob of relief and leaned in toward him, gently touching his face as if making sure he was real, that it wasn't just a dream. "Dad, you don't know how scared I was. You don't know how much we've waited for you." Jenna's voice cracked, but she tried to smile. "We thought we lost you, but now you're here." Trevor tried to remember what had happened, but the only thing clear to him was a deep emptiness. The last image he had was the roar of the engine, a sudden turn, the loss of control, and then nothing but darkness. "What happened?" he asked finally, his eyes pleading, seeking the answers he so desperately needed in Jenna's gaze. Jenna gripped his hand tightly, the memories beginning to flood back. She gathered herself a little and, through sobs, started to explain to Dad. It was night. The car lost control. We don't know exactly why. It was a terrible accident. I was so far away. When they called me, they told me you were trapped and that you had been badly injured. I couldn't believe it. I got to the hospital and I saw what happened to you. I thought I didn't want to lose you, Dad." Jenna fell silent, looking at her father as if she didn't want to leave his side. Trevor looked at her with an expression of pain, not only physical but also the anguish his daughter had endured, not knowing if she would ever see him again. The weight of those words crushed him more than he could have imagined. Imagined how he tried to speak but struggled to find coherent words. The truth was his mind was in turmoil. Everything seemed so distant. You were operated on urgently. You lost a lot of blood. Dad, it was so hard, but the doctors did the impossible to save you. Jenna said, her voice broken. She looked at her father, tears spilling down her cheeks. She didn't care that he was in a hospital or that he was recovering. She just wanted him to know how much she had needed him. And they did. If you're here, you're alive. At that moment, the hospital door opened again, and a small figure appeared in the doorway. Charlotte, Trevor's granddaughter, stood there with wide, sad eyes looking at her grandfather with a mixture of fear and hope. She slowly approached, not daring to say anything, but her eyes shone with the same emotion as her mother's. "Grandpa," Charlotte asked, her voice trembling. Trevor, with a titanic effort, lifted his trembling hand and reached out toward his granddaughter. Just seeing her there so close brought him a sense of calm. Charlotte ran to him, and when she reached his side, she hugged his arm tightly. The little girl's tears fell on his shirt, but he didn't mind. She only wanted him to be well. She just wanted him there. "Grandpa, I love you so much," Charlotte whispered, hugging him with all the strength of her little soul. Trevor closed his eyes, feeling the pain of life in his bones, but also the sweetness of being loved by his daughter and granddaughter. Despite the confusion, despite the wounds, he was surrounded by the two people he loved most. And for a moment, the darkness dissipated. Life finally had decided to give him another chance. "I love you both too," he replied, his voice trembling, unable to say more, with his heart tight from everything he had lived through. But in that moment, that was the only thing that mattered. The hospital room was quiet, quieter than Trevor had expected. The machines to beep softly, marking the rhythm of his life. And although the pain still throbbed in his chest, there was something in the air that gave him a certain peace, a contrast to the chaos of his accident, his fight to stay alive. But what moved him most, what truly overwhelmed him, was the presence of Jenna and Charlotte by his side. Night had slowly fallen, plunging the room into a darkness barely broken by the dim light of the bedside lamp. Jenna had had to leave, promising to return early the next day. But before she left, she had kissed him on the forehead, hugged him tightly, and made a promise. "We'll always take care of you." Dad. Charlotte, for her part, was asleep in a chair, hugging her teddy bear with her head resting on the table. The soft breath of the little girl broke the silence, and Trevor watched her, his mind working at its own pace, tied to the memories of the life he had been given. The accident, the pain, the physical wounds, all of that seemed to be fading little by little, replaced by a feeling of gratitude that gripped his chest. Despite the terrible experience, something inside him felt renewed. He had awakened from a very deep sleep, one full of darkness, fear, and the sensation that everything he had known could vanish in an instant. But it hadn't vanished. There they were, Jenna and Charlotte, the two people he loved most in the world. Trevor's gaze fell on little Charlotte, who slept peacefully, unaware of the weight of the world. What pure innocence, he thought, and a lump formed in his throat. My girl, my life. Sometimes he thought time ran too fast, and with every step he took, he saw her grow more and more. The day she was born, he saw her for the first time in Jenna's arms, her newborn face so fragile, so small. Now that same human being was a strong little girl with dreams ahead and a life full of potential. A smile escaped him involuntarily as he watched her, but at the same time, sorrow filled him. Life isn't always fair, and sometimes the time you want to dedicate to the people you love most just slips away. He thought of Jenna, his daughter, with her eyes full of love and sadness when she saw him wake up. He could still feel the warmth of her hand when she squeezed it tightly, as if in that gesture she were trying to transfer all the strength and love she had accumulated over the years. How much Jenna had given me. He reflected. She had always been his refuge, the one who never left him alone, even in the worst times. Even though he hadn't said it with words, she had always done it. It's what a father expects from a daughter, but she had given everything. Trevor closed his eyes for a moment, letting his thoughts flow like a rushing river. Thought about the mistakes he had made, the times he had failed, The moments when he hadn't been there when they needed him most, the decisions he hadn't made, the words he had never said, the hugs he had never given. Why did life give me a second chance? The question, though vague, pierced his soul. He couldn't stop wondering how he had gotten so far, why life had kept him with them in a car accident so severe, a surgery so complex. And here he was, watching how the two people he loved most slept nearby. Why am I here? The answer was clear, but there was something deeper, something more visceral. There was something he still didn't understand. With a sigh, he let his mind travel back to that dark night, that night when he felt the last flicker of consciousness before losing everything, that feeling of losing it all, not having time to say what he felt, or leaving Jenna and Sophia behind. The darkness of the dream returned with force in his mind, and Trevor couldn't help but let the tears gather in his eyes. The shadows of that image assaulted him, the voices of the people he loved disappearing into a dark abyss. Fear flooded him, and the tears began to slide down his face. He couldn't stop or prevent his emotions from overflowing. How had I been so blind? He felt foolish for being so trapped in his own world and his own problems without seeing how. Fortunate he was Jenna Charlotte, he thought, his heart pounding in his chest. They are the greatest treasure I have. I am nothing without them. Nothing in the room now, quieter than ever, surrounded him like an embrace. His tears were not just from sadness, but also from gratitude. Thank you, he said to the universe, to life itself, for giving him that gift. The gift of having them near, knowing that he could still love them, that he could still offer them everything he had left through his tears. He saw Jenna's silhouette in his mind. He remembered her voice, her laughter, the moments shared between father and daughter, and then Charlotte, his sweet little girl who wasn't so little anymore, but still held that pure essence of childhood. How could I not have realized it before? Trevor cued his head in his hands, squeezing his eyes shut, as if he could stop the flood of emotions coursing through him. I am lucky. I am so lucky. I've been a fortunate man. And now he understood with absolute clarity what truly mattered. The seconds passed, and his sobs gradually quieted. The stillness returned to envelope him, but this time it wasn't the stillness of darkness, but the peace that comes after an emotional storm. Looking at Charlotte asleep in her chair, and then at the door through which Jenna had left, Trevor couldn't help but smile, even though his eyes were red. Everything that had happened had led him to this moment, to this awakening filled with love, compassion, and the urgent need to never let those precious people slip away from his life again. Thank you, life, for everything you've given me, and for everything you still let me live. In that deep thought, wrapped in the stillness of the hospital and the love of his family, Trevor fell asleep, now with a peaceful conscience, waiting for the day when he could finally hug them and tell them how much he needed them. Trevor woke up that morning with a strange yet liberating feeling. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of his hospital room, illuminating the small details of the space, the constant hum of the machines, and the murmurs of nurses passing by in the hallways seemed more distant, as if little by little the noise of the world was fading away. Somehow, time seemed to have stopped when the doctor entered, accompanied by the nurse on duty. Trevor already knew what was coming. He had spent days recovering in the hospital, enduring Jenna's visits and comforting talks, and the constant care they provided. Although he was deeply grateful, something inside him told him that it was time to move on. Trevor, the doctor said, a kind smile on his face. Everything is fine. The surgery was a success. There are no complications. We've reviewed all the results, and we didn't find any additional problems. Trevor stared at him, trying to process the words while feeling the relief in his chest. The anxiety of uncertainty slowly faded away, replaced by a renewed calm. So am I ready to go home? He asked, his tone firmer than he actually felt. The doctor nodded, but before leaving, he gave one more recommendation. Remember, Trevor, you still need to rest. It's important to follow a light rehabilitation plan. Don't push yourself too hard, especially in the first few days. But other than that, you're free to go home. A sense of relief spread through his body, and his face lit up. I'm going home. I'm going to be with Jenna and Charlotte. Just minutes later, the hospital began to fill with new sounds, nurses preparing for his discharge, Jenna running in, eager to have him back, and Charlotte, who, despite being young, already understood enough to be excited. The three of them hugged tightly as Trevor crossed the door of the room. Already dressed and ready to leave, Dad, Charlotte exclaimed, jumping from joy and hugging him as tightly as she could. Trevor picked her up, holding her close to his chest with affection, feeling that warmth he had missed so much. "I've missed you so much, my little one," he whispered in her ear. Stroking her hair, Jenna looked at him with a mix of love and concern, not just for what had just happened, but for the future, for what was still to come. As they walked toward the car, she took his hand and squeezed it. "You know what, Dad?" Jenna said with a deeper look. "You're always thinking about work, about business, about everything except what really matters. You can't keep living like this, Trevor." Frowned at first, but soon saw the sincerity in his daughter's eyes. Something had changed in him too. Something inside him was urging him to do things differently. "You're right, Jenna," he replied, looking at his daughter. Then at Charlotte, who was already sitting in the back seat, gazing at the landscape. "It's time I did something for you both. I don't want to be thinking about work all the time anymore. I want to enjoy more time with you." The family arrived home, and while Trevor recovered physically, and the idea began to swirl in his mind, he decided it was time to change his way of living. He no longer wanted to be trapped by his own success, his obsession with work and money. He wanted to experience life differently, a life where they could enjoy each other's company without pressure. The next morning, after a peaceful breakfast, Trevor stood up from the table with determination. He approached Jenna and Charlotte, who were looking through a photo album in the living room, and looked at them with a smile on his face. "I have a surprise for you," he said with a mysterious smile. Jenna looked at him with curiosity. "What surprise?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the album. "I want us to take a vacation," Trevor announced decisively. "I want us to leave everything behind. Of it, work, business, worries. We're going on a trip to a place where we can enjoy the present. No rush, no stress." Charlotte looked up from the album surprised, and her eyes lit up immediately. "Really? Really, Dad?" she exclaimed, jumping from her seat. Trevor nodded, smiling widely, and crouched down to hug her. "Yes, Charlotte, this time I'll take care of everything. We're going to enjoy a few days of peace and happiness as a family." Jenna couldn't help but smile. But she also felt a mix of surprise and emotion. She knew that Trevor had made an important decision, a decision that would not only affect his life, but also hers. And Charlotte's. He had always been so obsessed with work, with making sure everything was under control. But now it seemed priorities had shifted. "Trevor," Jenna said softly, "it makes me so happy to hear you say that. I also want to make the most of this time with you for us." Trevor looked her in the eyes, grateful for his daughter's understanding and support. And although there was still much to heal inside him, he knew this was the first step towards something better, toward a more balanced life. Days later, they were ready to leave. Everything had been organized quickly. Trevor took care of the details, and all the stress that usually came with traveling had disappeared. It didn't matter where they were going, only that they would be together, and that made him feel more fortunate than ever. Jenna and Charlotte chatted excitedly as they walked through the airport, while Trevor watched them silently. Absorbed by the stillness in his mind, he felt that something had changed in him, something deep that he still didn't fully understand. But that filled him with peace. "Dad," Charlotte said, interrupting his thoughts, "do you think this will be the best trip of our lives?" Trevor smiled. When he heard her, he walked over to her, hugged her gently, and stroked her hair. "It will be, my love. It will be, because we're going to live it for real. Not just passing through, not just looking ahead. We're going to enjoy every moment." Jenna watched him and nodded. Maybe things hadn't always been easy, but finally the pieces were falling into place. She was grateful for this change, for the opportunity to live something different. The family finally arrived at their destination, a small tropical island surrounded by crystal clear beaches, palm trees swaying gently with the wind, and fresh air that seemed to soothe any anxiety there. In the simplicity of the place, they felt free, far from the worries of the outside world. As they walked along the shore, the waves gently breaking at their feet, Trevor looked around, deeply moved by the sun's beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, creating a scene of absolute beauty. "This is what we needed," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Jenna looked at him, taking his hand. "Yes, here with us. This is all that matters." Trevor nodded slowly. Yes, he thought this is all that matters. The island seemed suspended in time. The fresh air, the sound of the waves gently breaking on the shore, and the warm breeze that caressed their skin made everything perfect. During those days, Trevor, Jenna, and Charlotte gave themselves entirely to enjoying the moment without hurry, without worries. The routine of work and business was left behind, replaced by laughter, games, and deep conversations, the family had distanced themselves from the world to immerse themselves in the simple joy of being together. The day started early with a breakfast by the sea, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, tinting the sky with soft hues of pink and blue, while the aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked croissants mixed with the ocean breeze. Charlotte was jumping from one side to side, excited by the colors in the sky. Jenna, sitting next to her father, smiled as she watched her daughter run on the sand. "Do you remember when we were younger?" Jenna asked, looking at her father with nostalgia as she took a sip of her coffee. "You always said that success was the only thing that mattered. I thought you would never change." Trevor looked at her, feeling a pang in his heart at her words. He knew he had spent too many years obsessed with what didn't matter. Now, with clear eyes, he thought about what he had really. "Lost in all of that, I know, daughter, I was wrong," he said, his voice calm but laden with emotion. "I thought money and business could fill everything. But today I understand that it wasn't like that. This being with you, enjoying life, this is what really matters." Jenna looked at him with a soft smile. She knew that her father had begun to find peace, even if his heart still carried scars. Later, the family headed toward the beach. The crystal clear waters seemed to invite them to dive in, and Charlotte, as always, wasted no time running into the water. Trevor and Jenna stayed behind, watching her, their eyes filled with gratitude. The day was perfect. Charlotte dived into the water, coming out laughing and splashing excitedly. Trevor, looking at his daughter with a smile, slowly got up from his towel. "Shall we go?" he asked Jenna, as if they were planning something. "Big where to?" Jenna asked, raising an eyebrow, following his gaze. Trevor smiled. "I'm going to swim for a while with her. Let's enjoy this moment." Jenna watched, charmed, and nodded. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, of how he was changing, how he was no longer just thinking about the future but living in the present. Trevor joined Charlotte in the water, feeling the coolness of the sea against his skin. He dove in with her, chasing her through the waves and laughing with her like a child, completely forgetting the worries of the world. As the evening fell, the family gathered once again on the shore, sitting on the sand watching the sun slowly set, painting the sky with an intense orange and golden hue. It was a moment of calm, almost magical, where the land and sea seemed to merge. Jenna rested her head on Trevor's shoulder, and Charlotte, tired after the whole day, curled up beside him. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Charlotte said, lifting her gaze towards him. "Of course, my love. What's on your mind?" Trevor replied, stroking her hair as he looked at her tenderly. "How do you know if you've lived?" "Well," Charlotte asked, her seriousness surprising them all. Trevor fell silent. For a moment it was a deep question, deeper than he would have expected from a little girl. He looked out at the horizon where the sun was disappearing, and then turned to his daughter. "I think living well isn't about what you achieve or what you have. Living well is about making the most of the moments that really matter, and I am learning to do that now." Trevor smiled softly. "Being here with you and your mom, seeing the beauty of this place, laughing together, talking without hurry, that's living well." Jenna nodded, knowing that these words came from a man who had witnessed his own transformation. In the light of the sun slowly faded, and the sea turned a deep blue as the shadows of the evening stretched their fingers over the sand. Trevor, feeling a deep calm, rose from the sand, the wind caressing his face and the sound of the waves in his ears. He walked a little toward the water alone, while Jenna and Charlotte remained behind, watching the scene. When he reached the shore, Trevor stopped, looking at the horizon. This place, he thought this place was a gift. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost or what he still had to gain. He was only thinking about what he had before him, about what he had regained. The sun was setting, painting the sky with such warm color that it felt as though the entire universe was whispering to his soul. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and raised his face to the wind. "Thank you," he murmured, barely audible, as if the sea were listening. "Thank you for giving me another chance, for letting me see what really matters. Thank you for allowing me to live this present, for giving me the chance to be happy again." A few furtive tears began to his face, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. In that moment, in front of the vast ocean, with his family behind him, Trevor understood that life, though it hadn't always been easy, had given him something more valuable than everything he had achieved in his career: love and time and inner peace. When he turned around, he saw Jenna and Charlotte walking toward him, smiling. Trevor felt full, completely full. "How is the sunset, Dad?" Jenna asked with a smile, getting closer to him. Trevor looked at them, feeling an overwhelming wave of emotion in his chest. "It's perfect," he said with no further words. The answer was in his eyes, because now he knew he had learned how to live. The sun disappeared completely behind the horizon, leaving a soft twilight over the island, while the three of them hugged, sharing the most beautiful of moments of reflection, living in the present to be happy throughout our lives. We are often carried away by the frantic pace of routine. We focus on the future, on what we still haven't achieved, the goals that are yet to be reached. We become obsessed with the idea that success, wealth, recognition, or security will bring us happiness. And as we cling to these desires, life continues on, and we often let the simplest, truest moments slip away in that journey. We forget a simple but powerful truth: the only moment we truly have is now. The past is gone, and the future, though full of possibilities, do not yet exist. All we can do is take advantage of the present moment with its lights and shadows and find peace in it. Living in the present doesn't mean abandoning our goals or responsibilities, but rather recognizing that happiness does not lie in an uncertain future, but in what we live and experience today. It is in the smile of a loved one, in the taste of a meal shared, in the sensation of being alive, where the true meaning of life can be found. Sometimes we are so aware of everything we're missing that we forget what we already have. Family, friends, health is the small daily pleasure, like a sunset on the beach or shared laughter. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that unless we reach that goal or achieve that thing, we will never be truly happy. But in reality, what makes us happy is the ability to enjoy what is right in front of us, the embrace of a loved one, the peace of a quiet afternoon, the satisfaction of simply being alive. We live in a world that constantly tells us we must be more, have more, and do more. But the truth is that we don't need more to be happy. We only need to be aware of what is already here, of what we already are, and of what we already have. And when we make that decision, when we choose to live in the present, the weight of life lightens. We realize that the only thing what we truly need is to enjoy the moments that make up our existence, to learn to value what surrounds us, and to be present in every conversation, in every hug, in every gesture. Because in the end, it's not material achievements or titles that leave a profound mark on us, but the experiences, the shared memories, and above all, the love we've given and received. We are so focused on the future that we forget that the present is the only place where true happiness is built. Only when we stop rushing ahead and start living fully here and now do we find what we've always been searching for: peace, gratitude, and the joy of knowing that life as it is enough. So today, right now, choose to be happy, not in some distant future, not in a goal to be achieved, but in this exact moment, because in this instant, everything you need to be happy is already here. You just have to recognize it and be grateful for it. Happiness is not in what we lack, but in what we already have, in the now, because the present is the greatest gift life can offer. And that's all for today's video. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more content. See you in the next video.